Well, I'm just going to say hello to everyone who's jumping in tonight. We're going to give it a few more minutes, but I see that our participant gallery is quickly filling with all of our lovely guests tonight. And so we'll give it a minute or two and then we'll get started on this beautiful evening. We should have some lovely like waiting room music. I didn't think of that. All right, well, I'm one to believe in starting on time because we've all had long days on Zoom, and I really appreciate everybody joining with us again for this late but beautiful summer evening. So I am coming to you from Duwamish territory and the shared lands and waters of the Suquamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and Puyallup. And I'm Kathryn Bunn-Marcuse. I'm the curator of Northwest Native Art and an assistant professor in the art history department. I'm the director of the Bill Holm Center for the Study of Northwest Native Art. I am a settler scholar, originally from Hawaii, but living here in Seattle for many years. And I'm really happy that you are all here. I want to thank the Simpson Center for funding this wonderful series all year. This is the second in our Curating in Conversation series, and we'll have one more in May, which will be wonderful, and it will be with Miranda Belardi-Lewis, who is an assistant professor in the I School at the University of Washington and a Tlingit scholar of Northwest Native Art, and Ryan Feddersen, who is a Eastern Washington artist who has been really working with us at the Burke Museum, both as a co-curator and as one of the big installation artists at the Burke. So that will be in May, and I hope you can join us. So tonight I want to welcome our two guests. I want to let all of you who have joined us know that you can put your questions into the Q&A anytime, and we'll hold them and get them towards the end of the evening. But feel free to just put them in there so that you don't forget them. So I want to thank both Alison Bremner and Kathryn Duffek for being here tonight. I really appreciate both of their time and their flexibility in rescheduling. I'm going to introduce Kathryn and then Alison, and then Alison will have a presentation for us. So Kathryn Duffek is the curator of contemporary visual arts and Pacific Northwest arts at the Museum of Anthropology at University of British Columbia. She collaborates with originating community members to document and activate historical belongings, both inside and outside the museum. That is her passion, as is working with contemporary art and artists across cultural and disciplinary borders. And in her recent and current exhibitions and publications, Kathryn has continued to engage with historical Northwest Coast art and contemporary Indigenous knowledge holders, as well as examining the relationships between Northwest Coast art, modernity, and modernisms in the early to mid 20th century. And she's the author of a number of very significant publications in Northwest Coast art, including Lawrence Palya-Quelton, Unceded Territories, which was an amazing show at the Museum of Anthropology. Robert Davidson, The Abstract Edge in 2004, which many of you may have seen when it was at the Seattle Art Museum. She's been the editor on Bill Reed and Beyond, Expanding on Modern Native Art with Charlotte Townsend Galt in 2004, and the very important Transforming Image Painted Arts of the Northwest Coast First Nations in 2000 with Bill McLennan. And recently she's contributed to the newest volume in the Bill Holm Center series with University of Washington Press, which is called Unsettling Native Art Histories on the Northwest Coast. And she contributed an essay with Tahltan artist Peter Morin and curator Kathryn Bunn-Bassett. So welcome, Kathryn. And I was wondering if you wanted to say just a few words about what you're doing these days, or just a further introduction.
Thanks, Katie, and hi, everybody. I'm so pleased to be part of this and to see Alison again, at least virtually. I'm talking to you from the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And the museum that I'll be talking about, Museum of Anthropology, we're on the territories of the Musqueam First Nation. And we have a very long and always evolving and strengthening relationship with Musqueam. So we really benefit from that, and it's important to us. I hope I'll have a chance today to talk about some of the recent work that I've been doing with Jordan Wilson, my co-curator and co-writer. So we've been working, well, we opened an exhibit a few years ago that we've been modifying, and mainly working on a big project, which is a publication, and for which we got to spend some time talking with Alison. So hopefully we'll get to that later.
That will be perfect. I would love to, I know everyone would love to hear more about that once we see a little bit of Alison's work. So I'm going to introduce you, Alison. Alison Bremner is a Tlingit artist born and raised in Southeast Alaska. She is the first woman Tlingit artist to carve and raise a totem pole. She studied under master artist David R. Boxley and David A. Boxley in Kingston, Washington. She works in painting, wood carving, regalia, digital collage. She really is a multimedia artist. And in addition to her contemporary art practice, Bremner is committed to the revitalization of Tlingit language and the creating works for traditional and ceremonial use. And she has works in a number of important museum collections, including the Burke, where we love to see her large Fremont Troll installation, and also the section of the Northwest Native Art Gallery that she curated. She was one of the 6 women curators to put together the inaugural Northwest Art Gallery in the New Burke. Her work is in the Portland Art Museum, Château Musée Boulogne-sur-Mer in France, the British Museum in London, and of course the Frye Art Museum. And many of you may have seen her one-person show in 2017, Alison Bremner-Marcuse' One Gray Hair, which was curated by Miranda Belardi-Lewis. And we're very excited because Alison's going to be coming back to Seattle and living here next year, going to Cornish and following her arts education. So it will be wonderful to have you in town, Alison. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and maybe if you can introduce yourself or share your screen whenever you're ready.
Am I in control? It worked? It worked? Okay, great. This is my second time sharing the screen. Thank you so much for having me. It is so wonderful to be on the panel with both of you, and thank you so much everyone who joined in. My name is Alison Bremner, and I'm starting my timer. I'm doing a quick 10-minute presentation overview of my work. So I've been a practicing artist for about 10 years. The very first thing on my resume was a visiting artist at the Bill Holm Center. And this is a shot from that visit. I thought I was going to be a weaver before anything. So I was at the Bill Holm Center studying baskets. So very new artist, no track record. And the first thing I did at the Bill Holm Center was, this is the basket, I believe, was knock this old, beautiful basket off the table when I was going to shake someone's hand. And the room got so quiet. And I thought in that moment that I would never be back at the Burke, never be back at the Bill Holm Center. So to be on this panel, to have helped in curating the new Northwest Coast Wing is just so wonderful, a nice culmination of that long and lovely relationship. Let me see. So here's the Fremont Troll that was mentioned. It is a formline version of the cement Fremont Troll in Seattle. My work is humorous in its content, but uses traditional formline design to make up the figures. So I use humor as sort of a welcoming gate to maybe relate to people who aren't very familiar with Northwest Coast cultures. So this is sort of the direct visualization of that. My hope was that when folks walked in and saw this Fremont troll, something they might recognize, they have that automatic connection with the work, and hopefully it helps to connect them a little bit more with the more historical pieces that you see as you walk to the right in this wonderful new Northwest Coast wing. As was mentioned, I spent 4 years working with David Albert Boxley and David Robert Boxley. They are incredible Tsimshian masters. I really look up to them for their work, but also they modeled for me how an artist and how art is really just so connected with culture. You can't have art without culture and language. So I really appreciate my time with them. This is a shot from their incredible Soboleff Center screen. It's called Allah, and it's, I think it's about 20 feet high by 40 feet wide. At the time, I was mostly painting and just starting to relief carve. So there's a section on Allah, when you see the screen in person, David Robert Boxley, the son, let me carve about an inch V-cut on the main figure's right toe. So when you see the screen, it's that toe that really brings it all together. And whenever I tell that story, David R. Boxley is like, are you still telling people that? And I'm like, yes, it is my claim to fame. It brings me so much joy. But really, no, this was an incredible project that they did. Just seeing two artists tackle something that big was phenomenal. And I could, I think, talk about Boxley's for a while. They're wonderful. This was in 2018. What we see here is the culmination of the totem pole I carved under the instruction of David Albert Boxley. It's a 10-foot red cedar pole in honor of my grandfather. It is a raven on top, my grandfather's clan, and on the bottom, not pictured, is my grandfather holding a thermos of coffee. So on the left, we can see David Albert Boxley. He came up to Yakutat where it was raised, and he orchestrated the whole thing. And it also, I really like this picture because Nathan Jackson is in there too. And it meant a lot to me to have these amazing artists and culture bearers there. And in the back of the right, you can see Crystal Whirl, who's another incredible artist. Here's a better shot of the pole, the raven on top, my grandfather on the bottom holding a thermos of coffee. This is one of the pieces that is in the Burke exhibit. This is a style that I like to call a raven's cloak. So it is a piece of regalia that when worn, it takes on a transformative property, and the wearer wears the wings and tail of the bird, and I imagine it to be a raven. Here's another raven's cloak I did. This was called Through the Smoke Hole, and it envisions the Tlingit myth where Raven stole the sun and flew up through the smoke hole, and during the process, what was once originally a white bird turned black. So here's that white to black effect. Just for fun, here is Raven's Cloak number 3. I've only done 3 of this style. This is my mother and I. Of number 3 in the Château Musée Boulogne-sur-Mer. I like to include this one because this piece was in an exhibit at the Bill Reed Gallery. And so the picture to the left, just to the left of that, it was adjacent to Bill Reed's Milky Way necklace, the really intricate one with all the diamonds, and just mind-blowing. So that was like a Northwest Coast geek out moment for me to have my work so close to that piece. So that's why this is included. Jeff Goldblum. This is a life-size painting of Jeff Goldblum from the original Jurassic Park movie. Sort of a commentary about the male gaze and historical paintings of women in art. There are some aspects of the form line here that I'm super proud of. Jeff Goldblum's toe is actually a little form line piggy. So like the little piggies, a knee slapper. But I do traditional work as well. that I usually don't showcase online, social media, because really I feel like once it's given to the clan, it's really their traditional property. This is a screen I did for the Tlingit a number of years ago. And there are already pictures of this one online, so I felt comfortable sharing this one. But the question I do get a lot is, like, you just showed me Jeff Goldblum, how does your community take that, you know? And so balancing it out with a lot of traditional work that goes back into the community is kind of how I get away with my more humorous works. This is from the Frye Art Museum. These are the holographic wings. This is the show curated by Miranda Belardi-Lewis, One Gray Hair. This is a collaboration with artist Cole Speck. Cole carved the mask and I did the painting. I just wanted to sort of include a variety of works. I really stick with form line painting mostly, but when I'm able to, I really enjoy this style of painting. This is a solidarity design I did. They are the fist emojis from taken from the iPhone, but made into formline. This was in response to George Floyd's passing and the Black Lives Matter protests that happened this past summer. And proceed of the sales of this shirt went to the Crystal Kaiser Defense Fund. And so where my work is kind of going now, it's I'm exploring a lot with color. This is a piece that I did, I wish I knew the exact date, but as I was working on this piece, I had planned on pretty traditional colors, but during this painting, Marvin Oliver passed, and it really got me thinking sort of about how his work impacted me and just, you know, the life journey and the life cycle. So this is called Night Shift. And after I painted this one, I thought there was no way that I would ever use a dark background and that lime green again, but it's kind of my color palette now. I can't resist them. This is called Hanging Out with All of My Friends in Quarantine. And it is a person sitting on the ground with a messy bun, staring at their phone, very much by themselves. This is quarantine. Oh, I should have asked you guys before I put this one up. Is this okay? Should I skip it? Okay. Okay, I'm so sorry. I did not clear this with the Burke. I apologize. This is called, I'll skip the title of this one. This was a reaction to the removal of colonial monuments that occurred earlier this year. So this envisions a woman on horseback after the removal of the big one. So that I envision these little gray figures to be Mount Rushmore. And for me, it was also sort of a rebellion against, I guess, the statistics faced by Indigenous women. And this is a mural of 2020. It's a mural concept. I would love to do this full size someday. If anyone has a blank wall, let me know. From left to right, it is a student on their laptop, Raven interfering with the Zoom call and causing wardrobe malfunctions and kids running into the room on Zoom calls that we've seen on the news. We have two healthcare workers on either side of King T'Challa, and a mother who is now a stay-at-home / working from home mother and child. And this is the last piece in my quick little art overview. This is Pete Carroll trying to wear a mask. If you are a Seahawks fan, you might have noticed that Pete Carroll's mask rarely fell where it was supposed to sit. I was watching a game with him and the other coach Belichick, and they looked like little cloth caterpillars that sort of had a life of their own, going all over the place. So in this image, this is Pete Carroll and a little green figure is his mask with a life of its own. So thank you very much for having me. That's a quick overview of my art.
Well, Alison, thank you so much. It's just wonderful to see that trajectory and of course all of your humor, and you never ever have to apologize for bringing a work of art that comes from what you're thinking about into public view, even under the Burke umbrella, because it's always about, you know, how is contemporary art speaking to what's going on today? And I think one of the great strengths of so many of the really powerful contemporary artists, and I count you among them, is that familiarity and inquisitiveness and relation to all of the historical pieces, right? So to say you started off studying in the museum collections, I think that really provides this amazing foundation for where you're going, and of course working with the Boxleys as well. And so I want to turn it over to Kathryn Duffek, who has made a career of balancing both the contemporary and the historical Northwest Coast arts. And we would love to hear about your recent projects and what's going on at MOA and what you've been up to.
Well, first, I just wanted to respond a little bit to Alison's work, because it's so great to see what you're doing. And one of the things I love about your work is it just exudes confidence. I don't know if you feel like you're full of confidence, but your art really is. And I think it embodies one of the things that's really exciting about contemporary Indigenous art, Northwest Coast and elsewhere, is this confidence to kind of define the spaces that it's moving into. It's quite a difference from, you know, when I look back in the 1980s, when there was a lot of, you know, striving by contemporary Indigenous artists to try to be accepted by different kinds of art spaces, especially art galleries. For example, in Canada, the National Gallery of Canada, you know, these major art galleries, and to what, you know, and to kind of ask themselves, what was the price of admission to get into these spaces? You know, what did you have to give up in order to be accepted as a contemporary artist? And I still, you know, have these arguments with people, and I, you know, get kind of irritated when I hear, you know, this concept of contemporary art as being very removed from the kind of traditional roots that you're building your art off of, right? Like there's not this separation, there's not this feeling that you need to just slice it off and create something that functions very separately from the work that you do for community. So you kind of make a difference between work for community and work for the outside world, but it must be hard actually to do that, because they're really woven together. And I think that that's something that I notice in the work now of more and more contemporary Indigenous artists, that is a real, that like I said, it's confidence, and it's changing museums and art galleries and the full range of spaces where artists show their work. They're being changed by artists like you.
Thank you. I really, really appreciate your insight.
So Katie, you were, I also wanted to say, after your inauspicious beginning with museums and knocking the basket off the table, have you worked in and studied museum collections? Have you continued to do that over the past 10 years?
I have. I haven't as much in the past about 5 years since I moved up to Alaska, but yeah, the Burke, the British Museum, and actually Dempsey Bob was there accidentally, so it was a really wonderful thing. One of my favorite memories in life is Dempsey Bob helping me navigate the tube in London, just totally by chance. That was really, really special. And let's see, the Portland Art Museum and the Seattle Art Museum are the ones that I've been to. Hopefully post-COVID, I'll branch out more.
Right. Yeah.
Sounds like a trip to MOA is on your itinerary as soon as the border opens up.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, that's, I find like in the past 5 years, I guess, my focus has really been on the historical collections and historical Northwest Coast art in relation to the perspectives of contemporary Indigenous people. So contemporary Indigenous artists and activists and thinkers of all kinds, community members, some who are quite new to the art and some who have been studying it for years and years and years. And so in 2017, I worked with Jordan Wilson, who is a young Musqueam curator, and he's currently doing his PhD at NYU. And with Bill McLennan, the late Bill McLennan, who was a curator emeritus at MOA, and who sadly passed away last July, a big loss. But we three worked together, each from our different perspectives and experience, to organize an exhibit that opened the museum's new Elspeth McConnell Gallery of Northwest Coast Masterworks. So that opened in June 2017. And in that space, we made a decision that is not that common right now, which is to focus completely on historical works and not include contemporary works. One reason being that we had not a very big space for this show, but also we had now this new collection that had been bequeathed to the museum with some spectacular old pieces, like things that the museum had no other examples of at all, and that were returning back to BC after some of them 200 years, traipsing through the global art markets of the world and private collections. And so we had this opportunity to show pieces from the museum's collection and this new bequest, but to frame them completely within the perspectives of contemporary Indigenous Northwest Coast artists and other community members. And so in that way, we're bringing the two together. And so we had in this space, which there were very few strings attached for this gallery space from Elspeth McConnell, the donor from Montreal. But the name of the gallery was one of the things. So it was, Gallery of Northwest Coast Masterworks. So it kind of put this framework on this space that some of us kind of cringe a little bit, because the word masterworks is one of those words that carries a bit of colonial baggage with it. And especially in relation to Northwest Coast art. And not to deny that there aren't all these masterful pieces out there, but it's the question, who defines and what are the criteria? And so we're showing what were obviously masterworks in this exhibit. And yet the point of the show was to ask all of the participants who were working with us, how do you connect to these pieces that you might now have seen for the first time? And what the ideas that have come out of that are presented in the exhibit is that these are more than things. They're more than beautiful objects. They connect to communities. They connect to land. They connect to histories. They connect to governance. And so that's basically the gist of that project. And the book that we're working on right now, which is called Where the Power Is, Indigenous Perspectives on Northwest Coast Art, for which we had a great conversation with Alison. It builds on that idea and expands on it.
That is a really powerful gallery, Karen. And you've told our guests today that, it's historical work framed by the perspectives of contemporary artists, but can you say a little bit more? Can you describe it a little bit? Because it's a very multi-sensory experience in so many ways, from lighting to the audio. You took a really different tact with kind of attributions and provenance. I'd just love you to describe it for people a little bit more.
Okay, yeah, it's not a big gallery space. I never know square footage, so I won't even try. But we have about 120 or something pieces in that space, dating from like a few archaeological pieces where the date isn't really known to 1940 is the most recent work. And within this space, it's a gallery that will be used for other exhibits. This isn't a permanent exhibit, although it's a long-term exhibit. And so when you curate an exhibit for a space like that, you need to, well, like we were designing the space at the same time. It was a new space in the museum, a new gallery built, constructed with a donation from Elspeth McConnell. And so it had to have a certain kind of neutrality in terms of its design, you know. It couldn't be something really specific as a gallery space to this exhibit because it has to function for many, many years to come. But within the space, then we were able to create new cases that would function for this exhibit and others. But for this exhibit, we really wanted cases where people could get their nose right up to this incredible glare-free glass and really look at these pieces. So it was this, you know, weighing of looking at the making of a piece, you know, how it's made, what it looks like, and all that materiality of the art. And at the same time, when you're looking at these pieces, there's audio within the space that you don't choose to hear or not. There's no thing that you, headphones or whatever. It's within the space. There's speakers standing there on stands, quite visible. And so you might be admiring a beautiful carving, and then you hear Marianne Nicholson's voice beside you saying, we have to stop looking at these things as just art. You know, we need to begin connecting these things back to the land and back to the people. And so it's meant to kind of maybe jar you a little bit. So we're encouraging looking, close looking, and at the same time to expand beyond the idea of only an object. We also have 2 chairs in that space, very comfy red leather chairs by a Vancouver designer. And we call them idea chairs because they're set up so that when you sit on them, it triggers audio within the chair. And so you might think that you're just having a case of museumitis and need to take a break, but in fact, it'll be a learning moment for you because in one chair, you hear the incredible Clyde Tallio from Bella Coola, the young, very knowledgeable cultural historian, culture worker, who speaks about some New Hulk pieces that are right beside the chair there. And they aren't directly from his family, those pieces, but they are like pieces that he's familiar with. And so he speaks in that chair for about 22 minutes about how pieces like that are connected to family and genealogy and spaces within the landscape. And our designer at the time said, oh, you can't put 22-minute record, like nobody's going to listen to it. And we had thought that's okay. 2 minutes of listening to Clyde Tallio speak gives you a sense of this oratory and this knowledge, you know, the knowledge of the pieces beyond just the physical thing. But in fact, people stayed there and they listened because it's very engaging, and he's a brilliant speaker and storyteller. And in the other chair, there are 3 generations of Coast Salish women speaking about basketry. And we start with Jo Billows, who's a spoken word artist who speaks this piece called Red Lineage, where basketry becomes kind of a metaphor for the ideas carried down through her family. We have Sharon Fortney, who is a curator, and she talks about some of the modern, like 1940s, 1950s history of how basket making continued. And then we have Rena Point Bolton, an elder, solo elder, who talks about being a cedar bark radical, you know, in her day, and how important the continuity of this practice has been. So there's that. And then there are 5 large screens on the walls that have film that we commissioned that shows making, contemporary making. So you see the close-ups of Megan O'Brien weaving and Jim Hart carving his reconciliation pole, and all of these close-ups. So you get this sense of contemporary making within artist studios. We have video, close-up video of Nika Collison and Lyle Wilson and others holding the objects in their hands that you are seeing in the cases there. And they're holding them, you know, without gloves, and they're studying them, and they're examining them kind of with authority, right? And then there's a range of landscape imagery from beautiful Musqueam territory to the storage areas of the museum, kind of like the, you know, the bigger context for this work, the urban setting, that kind of thing. And then finally, there's some scenes from the Indigenous Dance Festival that happens at the museum every year normally, not in COVID times. So all of that is that framework of the contemporary, giving you a sense of this is alive, this is still happening, and yet we're looking at the old pieces within that space.
Yeah, that gallery is, I mean, I know it's under the rubric of masterworks, but I think it's a masterful curation as well. I mean, for me, it brings together so many of the experiences of Northwest Coast art that, you know, span from the engagement with the historical into the contemporary through all of the methods that you're talking about. And it's so rare in an exhibit to get that full sense, the sense that many of us who are really lucky to work in this field get when we get to engage with community and with the older belongings and with song and dance and ceremony and also contemporary making. And it really brings it all into that space in a way that is so rare for the sort of generally very quiet and, you know, spotlighted white box gallery. Or the very busy, you know, ethnographic full of interpretation kind of gallery. And so I want to applaud you and Jordan and Bill McLennan for that gallery, because it's quite amazing. And I tried very hard to use your example of people will sit and listen for 20 minutes in the new Burke, but we weren't quite given that moment, but we'll still work towards it, because that experience of sitting and really listening, even though 20 minutes is short compared to many of the ways that we like to listen, is so important, and people will engage with that. And so, Alison, I wanted to turn it back over to you a little bit, because one of the things that you mentioned is, and this is one of the questions from I have questions from my students in Art History 233 last quarter, was this sort of balance between working for community and your things for the market or things for the museum, which Karen, of course, referenced this dichotomy as well. And one of those interesting things that I was thinking while you were mentioning that is you sort of said, well, once I make the screen, you know, it belongs to the clan, it's theirs. And you, as the maker, Alison Bremner, you know, you fade a little bit into the background, although for people who are familiar with your art, you know, your signature is very much there on the screen through your style. But I was wondering if you have any thoughts about that, sort of those two circumstances of when you as the artist are taking the back seat because your piece is being put into clan use versus the, you know, the museum that says, Alison Bremner, you know, the one woman show, and there's your name on every label. And so do you have some, is that a strange feeling to be in?
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. Really quickly, I wanted to tell Karen it was great to hear how you had conceptualized the exhibit space with the glare-free glass, so people would get right up close. I didn't know that prior to visiting that exhibit space, and that's exactly what I did. I visited with another artist, and we were just like about 2 inches away from each of the pieces. It's a really wonderful exhibit. I really do enjoy the balance of work for community and work for public. It works out really well, just that exact balance, you know, in the commercial space, you know, your name is out there, but in the traditional space, I think as we know, it was never really about the artist. It was more about the ceremony and what would happen with that piece, and, you know, the history behind the design. So I really enjoy it. And it was a pretty easy balance because before I started putting my work out in the commercial space, my form line wasn't really up to par. And luckily I had David R. Boxley there sort of editing a lot of my early works. And most of those early works went back to my community. So there's a whole generation of kids who grew up with these little 10-inch drums where, maybe the form line isn't museum quality, but the passion is there.
That's really wonderful. And as Karen was talking, well, you're talking about drums, and Karen was talking about the films of the dance festival that happens at the museum. One of our students, Aaron Hoyt, asked, how do museums account for the performative aspects of Northwest Coast art? And I wanted to ask you both, Karen, if you have other examples of ways that you've brought that into exhibits over the years. And then Alison, I was thinking about particularly your bridal regalia on display at the Frye, which it's so exquisitely made. First off, it's the textile work you do is phenomenal, but to bring that very personal, ceremony and performative aspect of regalia into the museum that's a big choice to make. So I open that question up to both of you.
Alison, I want to hear about your bridal regalia first.
Sure, thank you. So I have never done a rectangular blanket without the help of my mother, Cheryl Easterwood. So for my wedding in, I think, 2017, we did a traditional Tlingit ceremony. So instead of a white bridal gown and tuxedo and bridesmaids dresses and tuxedos for the groomsmen, instead of that, I did a bride dress inspired button blanket. So it's a white frilly button blanket, and for the groomsmen we did tuxedo inspired button blankets, and for the bridesmaids we did bridesmaid dresses inspired button blankets. So they're sort of floral and sparkly. And so I'd love to thank my mother, Cheryl Easterwood, because she got the call where previously the biggest set we did was about, I think, 2 or 3 blankets. And so she got the call and I said, "Hi, Mom, how do you feel about doing about 9 blankets?" And she said, okay. So I really enjoyed that work. And part of including it in the Frye was just to sort of show the span of my work, also to show, that the culture is very much still living, still being practiced. And because I really enjoyed the idea that my mother's artistic debut would be at the Frye Art Museum with no prior experience.
That's a good intervention. And,
Yep.
and you had some wonderful Tlingit language parts of that exhibit as well.
We did, yeah. Down at the other end of the exhibition gallery, it was Tlingit language interspliced with Star Trek sounds. So if you've seen Star Trek, and the pinging sound, I think it's the Voyager makes, talking about how if we don't save the Tlingit language here on Earth, there are about 60 to 80 speakers left. If we don't save it here on Earth, maybe we can send it out into the stars and it'll survive somehow.
That's a lovely thought. Karen, did you want to address that idea of how to bring some of that performative nature of Northwest Coast art into the museum?
Well, I think that has got to be one of the biggest challenges for museums, because essentially a museum, that's what it does, is separate that out, right? It's not, you can't recreate that context of use, really. So you can have performances in the space. You can have that kind of thing happening as a public program, or you can have films that help people to get a sense of how masks are worn within a potlatch ceremony, that kind of thing. But the Talton artist, Peter Moran, who's a performance artist, he says museums have a tendency to lose the singing. And that's just, that's just so true, right? So we have the drums hang there in the case, and the button blankets, it might at the most be on some sort of a figure form, or else it's lying flat in the drawer or something. Everything is, you know, earthquake mitigated, mounted, so it won't budge, right? And yet there are so many ways in which these things, even when they're in the museum, are actually in a kind of motion, because you know, we think about these things differently. There's discussion and debate about how we should be thinking about these pieces. There are, you know, there are artists who come and study them and create something new that's inspired by them, and so bring that kind of inspiration out of the museum. And then increasingly, I know the Burke is really committed to this, and so is MOA, you know, to find ways of activating the collection by working with community. So in a range of different ways. So whether a headdress goes back into use for a potlatch by the family that still has rights to that piece, or a button blanket even, or our curator Sue Rowley has been more and more doing things like bringing a collection of baskets out to a community, just so people can visit with them and talk about them. And, you know, nobody's recording them and writing notes or whatever. It's for the community to connect with these things, right? And to visit with them and do what they want to do. And so I think that that kind of trying to think about outside the walls of the museum, like taking the collection out and bringing life to it and bringing more community into the museum and bringing life that way. It's a kind of activation that has to be at the top of the priority list for museums that have these collections of historical works.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's such a limit to what you can do in terms of making something seem active within the space, right? It's basically in a museum, it will sit there kind of quietly. But we need to do everything that we can to support the activation and the connection with people. That's what gives life and movement to these pieces.
That's such a good example. I've been thinking about this question for a long time because I'm very dedicated to trying to figure that out. And for a long time, I thought, well, how can we bring some of that experience into the museum? And I've sort of come to the idea that I'm not sure that the museum is the right space for that. That's not our role. And we have lots of roles that I think are helpful and that are asked for by community, but we're not going to pretend that we're a big house. We're not going to recreate. I mean, some museums have that inside, and they can do that with the help of community, but it's a very hard, that would be a very hard balancing line for a museum. But the activities that you're talking about, and MOA is one of the leaders of this, of taking pieces from collection, older pieces, and bringing them back to families and potlatches so that they can be there and either be danced again or just be witness to the proceedings, be part of the family. That's such an important part of this. And so I think that leads us into this question of collaborating with community. And MOA has been at the forefront of this for decades, setting the example of how to do these kinds of community collaborative exhibits. And Alison has recently worked with us at the Burke, as I said, as one of the 6 co-curators for the Northwest Native Art Gallery. And so, Alison, I was wondering if you wanted to say a little bit about that process, you know, if it was, first off, why did you say yes, you know, to getting into a several-year process and choosing from, everyone should know there's 10,000 Northwest Coast pieces at the Burke. And so our 6 co-curators had many, many pieces to work from and to figure out, you know, the messages they wanted to take, and a very, very small part of a small gallery to do it in. And I was wondering if there are things that you felt about that that were unexpected or exciting or challenging, and feel free to be honest, because these are the conversations that take us to the next place.
Sure, thank you. It's been really interesting to think about, you know, how do you try to connect a museum with community? And this is just maybe a very small answer, but I think MOA and the Bill Holm Center do a wonderful job. Even just artists visiting collections, we get to take that back out into our communities, and sort of like I do when I've visited the Bill Holm Center. I think both times I've definitely been inspired to create new work and give some of that work back to the community. So that's just like a tiny way, individual level. Curating, yeah, this was my first time really curating a space, and I was very grateful to be asked. I said yes because the Burke kind of feels like a little bit of a second home. I've come into the Burke not just researching by myself. I went in with the Boxleys once, and Robin Wright taught us how to do the traditional bentwood box tying. That was so great, just like outside of the little cafe outdoors in the summer. And I think as far as challenges, like you mentioned, just trying to whittle it down, because it being my first time from the curating side, it was interesting. I didn't have all the experience like Karen was mentioning, thinking of how people would encounter the space and down to the little details of the glass. That was just phenomenal. In my little section, I wanted to choose works that maybe don't always get the spotlight, works that are, so very much a part of the culture, but not as, famous as the totem pole. So we chose art brushes, and we chose, I think we have a sea otter arrow there, and also a basket, because I think the Tlingits, we're very well known for their basketry, but we don't have a whole lot of practicing masters. And one quick note, we put Cheetos and pilot bread into the basket because the late great weaver Terry Rothgar said that if it isn't being used, then it's dead. So she would force people to go out berry picking with her beautiful baskets, even though they didn't want to. She made them.
Yeah, the things that you brought together were unexpected, and they really speak to each other in a lot of interesting ways. And people do stop to look and see, we have several older and newer baskets and the Cheetos and the pilot bread, but you provided this wonderful explanation of why those things are there, and really engage people. They come, they sort of come from the far end of the hall because Ravenscloak is beckoning them all the way down the hall, and the big poles and things, and then they get into asking these closer questions. Karen, you've done so many pieces, so many exhibits where you're working directly with either the featured artist or with community members. And of course, MOA has maybe one of the longest histories of doing this. And I was wondering if you either wanted to reflect on some of your favorite moments of that, or maybe envision what are some of the next things that we need to do in terms of moving all of our museums forward in these kinds of collaborative projects.
A hard one. Yeah, I feel that I've been realizing more and more that this to realize that we have these collections in museums right now, and there's things that I think the repatriation is going to be growing, and it needs to. There's other forms of return, like we've been talking about, but overall, this idea of access to these museum collections is something that I think is really top of mind. To think about why is it that we have these collections now in these museums. Like, we have this institution that's undergoing a lot of change. Maybe they'll be changing dramatically in the future, but right now, we still have this museum idea, these big collections. What's the purpose of having them? Like, these collections weren't made for people like Alison and her generation. They were made with this assumption that they were for non-Indigenous people to, you know, learn from or enjoy or whatever within the context of a museum. And so this new kind of potential of the museum collections, like in the hands of people like Alison, you know, it was never predicted. And I think that museums need to do everything that we can to make sure that that's top of mind and really central to the kinds of exhibitions we do. Like one of the recent exhibits at MOA as well was done by Sue Rowley, and it was called The Fabric of Our Land. And it was an exhibit that was proposed to the museum by Musqueam, by the weavers of Musqueam, who know that the museum as a renowned institution has the power, like it's within this network of powerful institutions. It is able to borrow these great old pieces from museums around the world and bring them back to Coast Salish territory so that all of the weavers could, and community members could visit with them and study them. And some of these pieces, like from the Finland Museum, this incredible old weaving, incredible. It just made everybody's jaws drop at how colorful it still was. You know, it left the coast 200 years ago and lived in England all this time, or Finland all this time. I think mainly in darkness, that's why the colors were still so good. Didn't have any chemicals on it or anything. And so that idea of the potential of these old pieces, you know, to generate new knowledge, to generate, you know, to inspire new generations of artists. That's the kind of thing that I just as a curator, that is, I find the most exciting and the most fulfilling. And that as a museum person, you can help to support that kind of thing happening. That's what I would say is the direction I'm interested in. And so that involves working with artists, involves working with people who aren't artists, but have all sorts of other interesting perspectives on things. And I think that, you know, North American museums in Australia and New Zealand as well, because we work so closely with Indigenous communities, and increasingly staff is becoming Indigenous. The change is happening faster than in Europe, but things are changing in Europe as well. So there's a lot, you know, there's so many fantastic collections that artists and communities need to see and need to have access to. These are like teachers, right? These old pieces. So
yeah, that's what we always say at the Burke, right? These pieces are not living the lives they were originally intended for, but now they are the teachers. And as you say, I mean, Fabric of Our Land was such a great example, because not only was it a beautiful show for all of your visitors, and of course the weavers could come and see this on display the whole time, but I also know that there were days at the beginning and the end, before installation and after de-installation, there were community days for weavers to come and study really closely, as you say, these pieces that have been brought in from across the world, and to respond to the request, right? To use the power of your institution to respond to the request. Like, that's the greatest thing we can do. And to have that response, right? To be responsive to the communities that are asking for these, right? That's the greatest triumph you could do, because of course we have many, many decades of things that we don't want to celebrate that have come through, you know, museum histories. And that brings me, I'm going to ask one last question, then I'll turn it over to the questions in the chat that our audience has put up. But the practice of really responding, answering questions from artists and community, and making museum collections accessible was one of the great ethics of both Bill Holm and Bill McLennan, who, as Karen knows, Bill McLennan passed in July and Bill Holm passed in December. And so it's been a huge loss. These two, someone said these two giant trees have fallen, which I feel that very strongly. And so I wanted to get to ask you both a little bit about the impact of sort of the two great books, Bill Holm's Northwest Coast Indian Art and Analysis of Form from 1965, which has been printed, over 120,000 copies have been sold. You know, it's on everybody's workbench. Many artists just use the diagrams, not necessarily reading all of the tedious descriptions. And lots of people have called it, the Bible or the guidebook for Northwest Coast form line, Northern Northwest Coast form line design. But as well, transforming image absolutely opened so many people's eyes to the intricacies and the huge creative range across the Northern Northwest Coast. And that book that you did, Karen, with Bill McLennan and his incredible photography, I know that that's like the Bible at the Frida Deasing School, right? That's what they work on, and it's just, again, open on everybody's workbenches. And so I wanted to ask what you sort of thought about the impact those books have had. Alison, maybe addressed to you on the making of Northwest Coast art, and Karen, maybe a little bit about the art history on the Northwest Coast art, and where that has come from and is going, if you would mind.
Sure. Yeah, those are two huge losses. But like you said, those are the two books. Those are the two Bibles. If anyone is interested in learning formline, those are really the only two books that people will tell you to get. I actually have them both right here. My bookshelf is right there. So they're like never two steps away from my work table. When I was first starting out, the analysis of form by Bill Holm, I read it. I read the whole thing. I was so excited about formline. I woke up at 6 a.m. to read this book. So that's very much how I got started. And then when I moved on to my apprenticeship with the Boxleys, transforming image, David R. Boxley told me to get this, look at this, study it inside and out. And I know it changed his formline completely. And so the training that they were able to give me because of their studying transforming image is kind of how I'm able to read formline or speak formline fluently. And I still look at transforming image if I get a formline block for a bit of inspiration.
I guess for people who might not know about the background to the transforming image book, it was based on Bill McLennan's idea to adopt the use of infrared photography to photograph painted boxes and chests and box drums and house front painted boards with infrared film, and see what he could uncover, because there's so many of these old pieces in museum collections that have this dark patina over them. And although the painting is there somewhere underneath, and museums don't want to clean the ethnographically valuable grime off the front of the pieces, it was a way of uncovering this incredible database, it ended up being, of painted compositions. And what it brought to light was the diversity, the imagination, the inventiveness of painters throughout the 1800s, and the earliest pieces are from the late 1700s. And it puts a lie to this notion of, tradition being this lump of sameness, and then we can innovate nowadays. You look at the paint. I remember Robert Davidson talking about some of those dishes, the painted dishes that have this, what to our modern eyes looks like abstract composition. We're unsure, of course, how this would have been perceived back in the day, like in the 1860s or something. But there's a certain body of work, these abstractly, seemingly painted dishes, that Robert Davidson always sees as a new direction in the art at that time in the 1860s that was probably just cut short by the smallpox epidemics and everything. And so he always said, I want to take off where those guys, stopped. And they're still so intriguing to look at. And, I see some of these exhibit titles sometimes, like challenging traditions. And I know what they're talking about, but there's always this idea that we have to challenge the Northwest Coast tradition. It's not like, let's challenge the Western tradition. but the contemporary artists are doing exactly that. I think they're challenging the Western tradition, and they're saying, hey, you know, we're continuing with this creative art form, this boundless, you know, possibility of what can actually be done in something that still connects to the history and the place and the people. I don't know if I've answered the question, but I think that's what kind of comes out of the transforming image for me, is that, you know, the potential that you see when you have access to such a wide range of creations of these artists of the past. And that book helped to do it. I'm hoping that now, like one of the things that artists complain about that book is the pictures are so small, you know, and so I'm hoping that we can create a digital database through our MOA archives of all of Bill's infrared photographs, so that artists can continue the work that he was doing up until the very end in his retirement, when he was still working on these photos that didn't even make it into the book, and that he wanted to paint out and bring up to the students at Frida Diesing School and things like that. So artists can continue that work, right? So that they can access these images and blow them up to whatever size they need, so that they can really look at them. I think that would be a great legacy for Bill McLennan.
It absolutely would. And I think this leads us into some of our questions from the audience. Bob Moore, who's one of our great Burke supporters and one of the leaders of a group locally called Friends of Native Art, wants to know from Alison. He says, the form line style in your recent work is clearly Tlingit compared to your earlier work with the Boxleys. And was there a point when you realized that you should be doing Tlingit style form line instead of the way the Boxleys do it? And of course, I think that connects really well with transforming image that gives us that sort of breadth across the northern coast.
Right, yeah. Hi, thanks for being here. Yeah, that's a great question. From the start, both the Boxleys and I were aware that saying, you know, well, we're Tsimshian, we'll teach you what we know. They're incredibly generous with all of their knowledge, but you know, they're very honest with me that they'll teach me Tsimshian style, but since they're not Tlingit masters, it'll be up to me to go and look at the old pieces. Transforming image was absolutely recommended, the old boxes. So it was more towards when I felt comfortable with form line by myself. That's when I felt comfortable branching off into Tlingit style. But they gave me the foundation, and really after the foundation was when I was able to expand.
Nice. I am going to skip around a little bit in the questions so that we can kind of address them back and forth between all of us. And so, Karen, I wanted to ask you, Leanne Pollitt, I hope I said that right, says she's the director of a commercial gallery and looking to curate a show, a native art exhibition for one of our monthly exhibits. She wants to raise awareness and introduce the community to local art and artists, sell art, and be educational. The gallery's on the homeland of the Puyallup First Nation, so that's south of us in Washington, and wants to know our thoughts on focusing the exhibit on Coast Salish art and style, which, you know, would be what we have here in Washington State, versus the larger Northwest Coast, which is of course much more readily known for form line art. So this is a great question actually for either of you. But Karen, you and I know that awareness of Salish, and particularly as you get down to Columbia River, becomes less and less in the public eye.
Right. It sounds to me like a really great idea to focus on the art of the area that you're in. And Coast Salish art, I mean, this term Coast Salish, it encompasses such a diverse, you know, it's this anthropological category, right? To encompass, I think Jordan told me it's over 100 different nations, Salish nations. And there's so much still to be learned about Coast Salish art, and to be able to encourage new generations of artists to work within Coast Salish styles and to explore what has preceded them and to build on that, I think is really important. It's been, you know, there are some significant Coast Salish artists like Susan Point and others who have really led the way and built their own personal styles on a deep understanding and deep research into what exists of their art from the past. And I think that's only to be encouraged. It's a phenomenal art style, and I would love to see more co-salish artists working really confidently within their their ancestral art forms and building on that in their own ways.
Yeah, Alison, I don't know if you want to add anything to that. It's very interesting. Of course, Tlingit and Northern Northwest Coast art predominates down here, but I'm curious, in Southeast Alaska, is that the totally predominating, or do you get to see art from the sort of larger Northwest Coast?
We don't get to see art from the larger Northwest Coast. So I would really encourage, like you both said, to focus on Coast Salish and Puyallup art. Yeah, give it that platform. It's really beautiful.
Yeah, that's great. I'm going to read Lily Hope, who is a masterful Tlingit weaver, asks Alison a question. How do you reconcile making work for vibrant cultural use, which you do, but also making work that's going to live its whole life in a museum?
That's a really good question, Lily. I think they're both created for those intended lives. Like I'm thinking of the Burt Reynolds paddle I did that's living in the Hood Museum at Dartmouth. A paddle of Burt Reynolds in his famous bearskin pose, like that would never live anywhere in tradition. That would never live in Alaska. And I enjoy the idea that those different pieces will reach different people, throughout time. Hopefully some of the traditional works will be passed down, and maybe my grandkids will see them in a potlatch. Whereas I'm hoping the work in museums, which tend to be a little bit more contemporary, will give people, of course, an idea of our time, but also hopefully get them thinking a little bit more.
Can I add a little bit to that, Katie? The Museum of Anthropology commissioned Willie White, the great Chilkat weaver, Tsimshian, to weave a Chilkat robe. I think it was like 2005 or something. And it's a smaller size Chilkat robe. And it was a Canada Council grant. It was commissioned as a contemporary artwork, and it entered the collection in that way. And then at one point he thought, I wonder if I can borrow this for a potlatch. And he did, and it's probably the most used of all the pieces in the museum's collection. So it has this, again, kind of unintended life. I don't know how many times it's been danced in Alert Bay places, and mainly by young people because it's a smaller size. It's incredible. He's modified it over the years and when it comes back from a potlatch, he comes and he might need to straighten things out. He might need to adjust the tie on it. It has a nice smell of smoke from the fire. And so it's building this life, even though it was meant to be a contemporary artwork and still is a contemporary artwork, but it's also become something else.
It's such a wonderful thing when you have a piece that's like that. The Burke has a wonderful donated Raven's Tail robe by a group of weavers, John Beard and others in Washington, who donated a robe with the caveat that it could be checked out by people who wanted to use it. And so it has gone to University of Washington graduations and become part of that regalia. And it's really wonderful to see those pieces in use. Alison, you look like you wanted to say something.
Oh, I'm just really, really deeply enjoying that. I didn't know about that robe, and it just, my imagination, I picture the robe coming back in and all the other robes, sort of telling the rest of the museum pieces like what the culture is like now. And that's a wonderful bridge between communities.
It's great that you say, I had that same vision in my head, that it comes in smelling and everybody else on the shelves goes, oh, smells so good. I wanted to bring up this really interesting question by Charles Panzerzuski, who is a local collector of Northwest Native art. And he notes correctly that this discussion has mostly been about collections in museums, but of course that there are very strong collections owned by individuals, both of contemporary and historic art. And he asks, are there any moves towards gaining access to these private collections? And how have these current private collections been analyzed, if they are analyzed, and where they fit in the future? So that's a fascinating question for me to think about, because I have a terrible assumption that perhaps those are a little bit more walled off than the museum collections. But that question makes me think, maybe I should really rethink this assumption that I have in my head, and how can we help to connect these communities and the private collections? Do either of you have experiences or thoughts that you could add to Charles's question?
Well, I know that there are numerous collectors, all of our museums have borrowed for exhibitions from private collectors who have been very generous in wanting their pieces to be seen by the public, right? And others are very keen to have their work studied hands-on by artists as well. I think that because museums cannot afford often to buy much in the way of either contemporary or historical works, their budgets are often quite small. We rely very much on private collectors, and especially ones who, like Elspeth McConnell in our case, who collected for her own enjoyment and surrounded herself in her apartment with all her beautiful things, commissioned a lot of contemporary work as well as collected old pieces, but then always had this idea in mind that they would ultimately go to BC from her Montreal home and be closer and more accessible, so that artists could study these pieces. And so there was a commitment on the part of this private person who had the means to buy at all the great fancy auctions of Paris and New York, and take the time to enjoy those pieces herself, and then have this vision that she knew that they would do good for, in terms of the public education as well, but also to be accessible for artists and contemporary generations of Indigenous community members. That seemed to be really driving a lot of her purpose.
Yes, it's wonderful when we have those collections that start to engage with community, and then with the opportunities to how to either repatriate things or to put them into public repositories where they can really be learned from and enjoyed. All right. Paul Nicholson asks, Alison, I remember the QR inspired prints at the Frye, and I noticed the repeated representation of screens and screen devices in your recent paintings. Do you intend to create art for on-screen presentation in the future? And does that mean sort of more digital things? You can interpret that.
Hi, Paul. I considered attempting to make some NFTs possibly, but that is pretty far down the to-do list. So we'll see if NFTs are still making the news once I finally get to them. But I've considered it, yeah.
Do you want to tell people what those are? Because some people might not know.
Yes, I forget what the acronym means, but they are pieces of art that essentially kind of only live online, and you buy the image and you buy, I think, a code that's created on a blockchain, and I really don't know what any of this means, but yeah, you're sort of buying this ephemeral thing, and it's made the news. One of them sold for like millions, and I think it was like 60 million or something. Just a digital piece of art that you don't really own, but you do somehow. Not a great explanation. Google it. Sorry.
One of our wonderful guests says it stands for non-fungible tokens, and it's been quite in the news lately. Yes, for sure. I want to address this question. Sandra Wood says she's a basket maker and she treasures the amazing collection of Indigenous basketry at the Burke. But she was really disappointed when she went to the new Burke to find few baskets on view in the public. She said they were presented as art with not enough notation or information about origin, date, tribe, maker, materials, or technique. And artistry, of course, is only one aspect of Indigenous art. And so why is there not so much context at the Burke? And so I'll say a little bit, if you go upstairs, you can see into, we have some open collection spaces where you can kind of see in through the windows, and you can get a very, very small view into our basketry room, which is separate from everything else because it has different temperature controls. I think we have about 8,000 baskets from the Northwest Coast, and they're kept a little bit dark, so you can't see as much. And so it's not, you don't get to see as much of those as in other parts of the Burke. And then we do have some baskets on display. So for instance, if you want to say a little bit more about the baskets in your exhibit, and then there were some presented by Pat Courtney Gold, who is a Wasco artist from the Columbia River. And she really brought those out in her display is a little bit more about what were the original roles for all of these pieces. But of course, we suffer at the museum from the small label syndrome, and then trying to figure out how much can you present in writing. Are there other ways that you can get that information across? But I wondered if you wanted to say a little bit more about the baskets you chose, and Karen, if you have any thoughts about how you bring out basketry at MOA. Alison, do you want to say just anything else about the baskets in your exhibit or spending time studying baskets at the Burke?
Sure, I think that is really great feedback as a first-time curator, that maybe the context of baskets didn't quite come across. I did give it my best shot in the space, hoping to, to add food and make it a little more alive. But I really do appreciate that feedback, and I would definitely agree that baskets don't quite get the love that they should. They're incredibly intricate, and my hands go up to weavers of all kinds.
And they really need that close examination. And Karen, you're talking about the non-glare glass, like when you have to be 2 feet, 3 feet away, you lose that the incredible intricacy and the appreciation you get when it's right up in your hands and close to your face.
Yeah, I mean, the amount of information that we cannot deliver, it's always such a dilemma. Like it's, the making the basket, everything from the philosophy, to the whole approach to the ecology, to the science of knowing the ecology so that you know how to gather your materials, and then the spiritual aspect of it, and then the technology of it all, and the uses of these things, and then the social history of basketry, within, like during the Depression years and all of these years when basketry was just a phenomenal woman's economy, right? People were really bringing in income for their families through basketry. So there's so much. And in fact, I love the Burke Museum's basketry website. Like you guys have a really informative website, and that's the kind of thing where you can present some more information that way. In the exhibit that we did in that Masterworks gallery, and this was very much the insistence of Jordan Wilson, who really wanted to bring, he was just, really working toward representing women's arts, things usually made by women traditionally, into all different thematic areas within the exhibit. So not just have the case of basketry, but to also include basketry within other kinds of themes that we were exploring. So that opened up a different way of looking at basketry within that exhibit. But in terms of like word count and giving big extensive, we weren't doing that either, giving a lot of background information. Although in our idea chair, you get a little bit more again from people speaking. So that makes it a bit easier to simulate some information when it's being spoken to you while you're looking at these things. It's a challenge.
And actually, I'm glad you brought up the gallery again, because Linda Raymond asked you, Karen, is that Elspeth McConnell Gallery going to stay in place for until after the border opens again, or sort of for how many more years do you guess?
Well, the exhibit, it's called In a Different Light, was originally planned for about 2.5 years. And right now we don't actually have an end date. We just made a few changes in the exhibit and brought in some different pieces, but we're quite reluctant to take it down because there is so much work in it, and people really seem to be enjoying it. And we have so much other stuff going on at the museum. And so it'll be up probably for another 3 years or so.
Oh, good.
The
I
board
cast my vote for keeping it for a while. It's so spectacular, and you can visit it over and over, and then it's also just a model for really interesting curation. So we just have a few minutes left, and I wanted to just make sure if we had any time for either of you having questions for either of you, or if not, if you wanted to just say one or two more things about what the next thing is on your project radar. Karen, you want to go first?
Okay. The next thing on my radar is I'm working on an exhibition project with the Tsimshian and Haida scholar and curator Marcia Crosby. We've been working together for a number of years on looking at the modern period for Indigenous people in British Columbia, like the turn of the century to about the 1960s, not just in terms of art, including art, but looking very much more broadly at cultural production within this time frame. Her concept of new cultural practices that she's been exploring a lot within her own research, including public, like things like parades and like urban-centered cultural performance through that whole period of radical change and ongoing oppression and major racism, and yet people were carrying forward their cultural practices and using new media of the time, looking globally at, in terms of being really mobilized, working toward creating a better future for themselves. And so we're planning to create an exhibit for 2023 that is an immersive one that really draws on film and archival photography and voice to create an immersive space to take a new look at that period of history.
That is going to be phenomenal. I'm so excited to hear about that. Alison, what's on your radar?
That sounds amazing. And really quickly, I wanted to say to Karen, I'm so glad the exhibit will be up for another couple of years at least, because it is really one that you need to go to a couple times, and I would like to go to again post-COVID. Next is a mural at the Juneau Airport here in town. They're remodeling. So in early May, I'll be getting in there. It'll be 8 by 10 sections. So when travel opens up again, come to Juneau, check it out.
Well, I definitely will do that. And I'm so happy to hear that. I'm a huge proponent for public Indigenous art. And the more we can have, across our cities, the better. And I want to let everyone know, first I want to thank Alison and Karen so much for being here tonight. I found parts of this just really exciting, and I can't wait to come and visit again and to hear the new things that are going on. And Karen and I were talking about, this is really a wonderful time to go to museums. We have been reading the research that said they're very COVID safe. Both the Museum of Anthropology and the Burke are open. And we have very low, we have set our numbers low so that people can come in and be safe. And so it's just a lovely time to come and spend some time visiting at the museum. So I hope you will all do that. And additionally, for those of you who haven't been to the Burke since last summer, we were speaking about art that hasn't gotten as much attention over the years. We have a new wonderful public installation right outside the doors of the Burke, which is called Guests of the Great River. And it's a set of 13 Columbia River style paddles done in bronze by Tony Johnson of the Chinook Nation and his artistic partner, Adam McIsaac. So those will be wonderful when you come to the Burke and see them. So I hope you all will. And thank you again, Karen and Alison. It's been really wonderful to have this conversation with you.
Thanks so much for inviting us.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Absolutely. I can't wait to see you all in person, and everyone else who's in our audience, thank you for joining us tonight and enjoy your evening. Good night.
Bye.